that's not so interesting. So now I bring her back, but I leave her biased into flexion because I'm doing the flexion quadrant. Right? If I brought her into neutral, I could start there, but I already know I'm interested in the flexion quadrant. So I flex her up. I feel how the lumbar spine is biased in flexion. My hand is at the sacrum. I keep her lumbar spine in flexion. Notice the little hip shift. Lift the legs, bring the hips into some extension, but do not let the lumbar spine extend. Okay? Now, extension is associated with a right side bend, right? Because that would be an extension slide. If we were to side bend Sandra to the right, that would be a down slide of the right facets. We don't want that. So essentially, you want to make sure that she stays in neutral or even into a left side bend because that's the flexion slide of the up segments. Got it? So if we were to straighten, because we need to offset the legs, so I'm going to say I'm going to have you straighten the bottom leg for me, but just to about here. I only offset the legs, that's it. Because if she straightens all the way, can I pull this up? Okay. If she straightens all the way, go ahead and straighten your bottom leg. What happens? She side bends to the right, which induces extension here, so I've totally lost my bias. Got it? So I'm here, I flex her, extend the hips a little bit, and I guide her leg towards this corner, and only a little bit to offset the legs. Now her lumbar spine is biased into flexion. I offset the arm here. The bottom arm, same idea. We want to bias this into flexion. So if I simply pull a neutral, this would be the neutral locking down from above. But I want to bias her into flexion. So there are two options now when we do the bias. You can either have the arm position at 60 degrees of flexion, and this is written up on slides further down, or 120 degrees of flexion. If I pull her at 120 degrees of flexion, I will induce that right side bend. I lose my bias. So I am now going to keep her at 60 degrees of flexion. Start to twist her here. Are you okay there? Mm-hmm. So palpating, I'll twist, working all the way down. So now the whole spine is twisted, biased into flexion. Tuck that arm, and then I'm coming in here. So I've now just taken up the slack of her spine, biased into flexion. In other words, I've brought her into that flexion left quadrant. I've biased this whole right side into a flexion slide. Hold on. Okay? I come over, thighs are against the bed. I'm just going to partially roll you towards me so I can see what's going on. And here we are. So now she is in that limited quadrant. I've biased her into the point of her limitation, probably, and I start with my palpation. Come through, I feel the muscles. Do I feel tone a little bit? I can do a little strumming. Am I getting the reactivity here? I palpate. This is called the step assessment, where when you twist, essentially your spinous processes should just gradually spiral into a step pattern. So as you're palpating, you're like, boop, this one's higher than that one, that's weird, and then this one drops lower. Okay. The spinous processes are probably the most anomalous bone in the body, so you can't use this as your main test, but as you do this, you can kind of get a sense if one feels like it has a malposition compared to the others. Then I'm going to do a general PIVM, and I can do that from above or from below, but what you have to think about is that you're going to bring her out of her twist. So she's twisted into a flexion slide here, so I can bring her forward a little bit and then back. And I'm feeling for the movement in between each segment as I'm working my way down.
Wouldn't this be your pet? No, I guess you're not saying pet.
Nope, still PIVM. Okay, because what I'm feeling for is the passive intervertebral movement. I want to feel how she moves. Now I'm going to do it from the pelvis. So I can take the pelvis, I have her side bent and flexed. So what I do is I'm bringing her right pelvis up towards her right shoulder. In other words, out of that flexion slide. I'm bringing her L5, S1 into extension, and now into flexion. Into extension, into flexion. And I'm doing the flexion by bringing her into a side bending up or a side bending down. Right? This is the pelvis moving down. That is inducing essentially a relative left side bend. It's increasing the flexion motion, and I'm feeling for the motion in between the individual segments. That's your PIVM. For it to be a PAIVM, you need to so you could do a PAIVM with overpressure, which is what you learned, but you learned it in cardinal plane here as a combined movement. That's a PIVM with overpressure that I believe Dr. E referred to as a PAIVM. But for it to be a true PAIVM, it's a passive intervertebral accessory motion, which means you should be on the articular process feeling for the articular glide. And here I am feeling for an upslide, but how am I achieving the upslide? I'm exaggerating. By pushing the pelvis down. So I'm doing a relative upslide. I am hooking the upper segment, and I am pulling down on the lower segment through the pelvis, but then I'm also on the articular pillar. So it's a relative upslide. So I can feel where the limitation is. What?
You also do it the other way
From above? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, here you are. And then you have to get, the trickiness is the angle from above, because you're technically rotating her to the right, which would be a downslide. But because of the side bending angle of what you're doing, you can still get that flexion slide, that opening slide. You can use the ribs, but you have to use the fleshy part of your forearm on the ribs, and you're anchoring on the articular pillar so it's more comfortable. You don't want to crank, especially on a flexible body, on the ribs. Okay? So a large distribution of contact here, and then you can do it here, but I would go through the pelvis, right? Easy to go into a minute from here. So start to train your PAIVM assessment through the pelvis. Okay, go ahead and bend your knees. And just reach forward off the bed. I'm only doing this because that was a lot of extension. This is a really nice stretch. You okay? Okay, and come back. Okay, that wasn't part of your technique. It was just she was too long in extension that way. Yeah.
So when you were talking about moving the pelvis in terms of mobilize,
Yeah.
And you were saying that you're gonna arc it down to that relative left side bend.
Yes.
When you said you bring her back into almost like a little extension, that's just back to almost her neutral position where she started.
That was for the PIVM. Yeah,
For the PIVM.
for the PIVM, because the PIVM, you're getting a sense of the intervertebral motion.
Yeah.
So you're kind of bringing them out of the end range into the end range. You're seeing what's their journey like as they come to that end range. Because although you just spiraled her from above and below with a flexion bias, it's really not her full end range. As you're moving into it, it's the end range. But take them out of even where you are so you can get good running room to see how do they wiggle in between each segments. That's what a PIVM is. It's more of that wiggle between each segments. And if there's a positive PIVM, you're like, gee, that intersegmental motion is not great. I still don't know if it's muscular or articular, so I go into the joint itself and I do the joint glide. If the joint glide is limited, I know it's articular, do an articular treatment. If the PIVM is positive, so there's limited motion in between the segments, but I go in there and I do a PAIVM, and that's fine, I know it's not because of an articular limitation. So they still have a PIVM limitation, but it's more myofascial or possibly dural. That's your structural barrier differential.
So when you get them into the bias, you flex it up to L1 and then lock it out to
We're-
L1?
We're not locking out, so there's a specific locking technique that you will pick a segment.
Right.
So you are generally biasing into flexion throughout. So the whole lumbar spine up to the TL junction L1 will be somewhat flexed, but not fully flexed. And then you extend the hip, you're losing it a little bit, but you're biasing it into flexion.
Because of that, your hands on the sacrum. Like
You're stabilizing the sacrum to avoid the pelvis from anteriorly tilting and it going into the low back. So it's a bias. And then you pull and you just generally twist, spiral the spine down into a bias of flexion, and then you get in there with your PIVMs. For your treatments, you can do a specific lockdown and take up all the slack and go right to your treatment segment.
I think he's asking when do you stop?
When you pull, when you lock out, when you pull the arm.
The arm,
When do you stop?
just when you get the spiral. So you might not even be fully at end range. So you're getting here, I've taken up the slack, It's not her end range, there's more, but I've taken up a bunch of slack. And I've biased her into extension. She is not locked out. I've simply biased, straighten the bottom leg for me. So now I can play. All right, now when I bring her here, she's not in full flexion yet. I still have all that motion that I can do. Now I'm bringing her to end range. Okay?
I think what you're saying that as he palpates the lumbar spine with his left hand, he's just feeling for that expansion.
Okay. Yeah,
Once he feels that expansion coming, he's like, okay, I've done expansion through that lumbar, then I can stop.
Yeah, okay.
So in the dysfunctional segment, you won't get the rotation you're looking for, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is where we said there's an anterior left limitation. So there are three possibilities: articular, muscular, dural. So I've now positioned into biasing that segment into that flexion quadrant. In other words, the upslide of the whole side. The way I can differentiate is there an articular glide or is there not an articular glide? I localize a segment, because I don't know which segment it is. I localize a segment based off of a PIVM assessment. So I go through here, and I do a more gentle assessment. Okay, I start up here. Seems like L12 is moving, L34 is moving, L45. Oh, L45 is not moving. I go down to L5S1, L5S1 is moving. And then your patient goes, oh, it's a little uncomfortable. Interesting. Possibly L45 is the stiff segment that's stuck in ERSR, and L5 is getting compressed. So now I go, that's a positive PIVM for L45 into flexion. But why? So I get in there and I say that's a positive PIVM, but is it a positive PAIVM? I go in, I anchor it, I do a relative slide from below, or I do a direct slide from above. My end feel is firm and non-yielding. Capsular. So there's an articular limitation in the upslide direction of L45. In other words, yes, L45 is ERSR. And when I poked on L5, it was painful, so I'm thinking that's the painful compensatory segment. But now I can treat the L45 and try and create some room for L5S1. Okay? Practice that one, because your next step will be to do an extension PIVM PAIVM and see if, yes, L5S1 is the painful one. And the secret is, it is. Okay. Yep.
You go through the hip for all of them, right? You do PIVM through the hip.
You can do it from above or from below. I want you to practice from the pelvis, because that's going to give you the most mobilization force. But for this particular patient, actually for this particular patient you could do it, because moving through the pelvis you're still opening up L5S1, so L5S1's happier. But for some people you can't, you have to go directly on L4.
Yeah.
Okay? So try your